This is my journey. Inspired one story at a time, a library of leaders was created. It began as a journey to learn. As time went on, it began to grow. All it needed was a platform, and this podcast was created to listen, to inspire, to share. I am a storyteller, and this is my journey. Welcome to another episode of Profiles in Leadership. I'm your host, Steve Anderson, and this episode is brought to you by Silna Health. That's S-I-L-N-A, the premium front-end RCM company that leverages technology with a team of onshore insurance experts to handle benefit checks, eligibility checks, and prior authorizations. Finally, a vendor that you can trust, like a full-time employee that scales with your business. Just mention the Profiles in Leadership podcast to receive a free trial. Today, our guest is Dr. Laura Gallaher, who is a professional speaker and organizational psychologist who inspires driven self-starters to transform their relationship with themselves to accomplish more than ever while making everything easier. While sharing revelations on radical self-acceptance, she uniquely leverages humor to resonate with audiences. She is an approachable, funny, warm, alluring, optimistic, curious, and delightful speaker and guest. Even as a USA Today and Wall Street Journal best-selling author, Dr. Laura doesn't fit the typical academic personality of her PhD peers. Some of her noteworthy achievements include being hired by NASA to transform culture following the Columbia accident, working with Disney to lead radical shifts in performance management for their leaders, and inspiring Yahoo's global teams to seek transformation from the inside out. Fun is always abounding with Dr. Laura's life, so when she's not serving a mass self-acceptance movement, you can find her water skiing, floating in a sunny pool, likely on a large peacock floaty, playing with her dogs, singing while playing her beautiful grand piano, or diving deeper into her own consciousness to live life most fully. Welcome to the program. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
So let's just start with a little context for our audience. So let's, just kind of tell us where you grew up and how you ended up in Orlando, Florida.
I grew up mostly in Phoenix, Arizona. I was in Minnesota when I was really little. So my earliest memories are, cold, dark winters and lots of snow. But I left
Okay.
that behind a long time ago. My family's actually still in the Phoenix area. And I was there through college, but I went all the way to Florida for graduate school. University of Central Florida had a really strong industrial organizational psychology PhD program. And so I came out here, which is like 20 years ago now. And I was only a couple years into that program when I heard that NASA was hiring organizational psychologists, which was a very wild way for me to start my career.
Yeah, I can imagine. So tell us a little bit about what is an organizational psychologist, and I assume you wrote a dissertation for your PhD. So what was that about?
So, psychology is really about understanding, explaining, and predicting behavior. Organizational psychology is understanding, explaining, and predicting behavior at work. So, what do we know? What does the science of human behavior tell us about how human beings show up in an organizational context? What really makes excellent teamwork? How do you truly motivate people? What does good leadership look like? And there's a whole element of that field that I don't get into too much anymore, which is how can we select the right people for the team? How can we use psychometric instruments in order to use statistics to predict somebody's job performance based on how they answer these items? So it's that whole thing.
Yeah.
And my dissertation was a little strange, at least according to my department, because
Okay.
I studied humor, and that was not done very often at that point in
Interesting.
time.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a weird situation. So just to date myself, I was in the library at University of Central Florida looking up journal articles. Some journal articles were online at that point, but the most prominent journal article source for us was not online. And so I was regularly going into the libraries and pulling out the actual journals and flipping to the pages and going to the copy machine and making copies. And so that's what I was doing on this one afternoon. And as I was on the last page of all of the work cited, I saw the title of the next article. And it was something crazy, like towards a higher grade of manure, the use of humor in the workplace. And I was like, what is this? This is so
Okay.
interesting. And I sat there with that journal on my lap, like on the floor for an hour reading that article. And I was so captivated. Chris Roberts was his name, and he had written this article. So he was probably the most prominent humor researcher at that point in time. But I'm, 3, 4 years in my PhD program, and I didn't know anybody had studied humor at work. And I was so fascinated. And so I brought that back to my dissertation advisor. And I give her a lot of credit for being fairly open minded and willing to go with me because I
Yeah.
was bringing so much energy to it all. And I said I wanted to study leadership and humor. And she said, well, leadership's not my area. And I don't know anything about the research of humor. So we can do humor, but let's keep it in an area that I know a lot about, which is selection. So, Steve, are you ready to hear the name of my
I
dissertation?
I cannot wait. Let's hear it.
Okay. So it was called The Moderating Effect of Gender on the Use of Humor During a Job Interview. That's what she said.
I love it. Love it.
Yeah, this was back in like 2010, like
Yeah.
15 years ago. And The Office was very popular. It was kind of the height of the popularity. And so that whole joke of that's what she said, the fact that I was studying humor and gender, I had a lot of fun with it. I mean,
Yeah.
the dissertation was a ton of work, but
Oh, I can only imagine. Yeah.
yeah, nothing like sucking the fun out of a topic like humor, like doing a dissertation on it.
Yeah, yeah, no kidding. So you mentioned it. I said it in the bio, and then you mentioned it right away. So I'm always intrigued. How does someone like yourself, get on with NASA and Disney? I mean, these are huge. I would think anybody in a leadership role would want to work for those companies. So how do you get hired by those companies?
Yeah, powerful brand names for sure. So with NASA, they were looking for organizational psychologists because of the Space Shuttle Columbia accident. And I'm happy to get into that some more if you'd like.
Sure.
I'll follow your lead on this, Steve.
Okay.
But they knew that there were things happening in their culture that were detracting from mission success. I mean, they basically blamed culture for the Columbia tragedy where NASA lost all 7 astronauts. And so my now business partner, Dr. Philip Mead, was leading the culture change initiative at Kennedy Space Center. And they had just said that NASA was the number one place to work in the federal government, according to a survey of governmental employees right before the accident happened. And so it raises a very curious set of questions then of, well, what is culture? If it's not about having the most engaged workforce, it's not about having high job satisfaction, what's missing? And so Dr. Philip Mead learned about organizational psychology as this whole field that exists to help us better understand what are some of the invisible forces that are impacting the beliefs and the behavior of the human beings, which is exactly what they needed to be paying attention to in order to design the culture in a way to ensure mission success. So, my roommate at the time was actually interning at NASA. He was in a PhD program for engineering. And so that made total sense to me. I was like, you're an engineer, you work for NASA. That makes sense. Like,
Yeah.
he said
Right.
they were looking for organizational psychologists. I was like, the NASA? I
Right.
But then
Yeah.
I got that context and I thought that makes so much sense. And they were really wanting to create a culture of psychological safety um,
Hmm.
because there were people at the agency that were afraid that Columbia might not return home safely. And so there was a lot of miscommunication and a lot of poor decisions that were made, not by stupid people, by actually very, very smart people. And so that's what led NASA to want to hire organizational psychologists. I happened to know 2 people who were already working inside NASA and they recommended me. And so that got me the interview. And I'd like to think that the interview itself got me the job.
Yeah, well, good for you. That's
Thank
impressive.
you.
I've got so many questions here, but let's while we're on it, let's talk about the Columbia accident a little bit. And
Yeah.
you know, you've written this great book that we'll talk about later as well, called "The Missing Links." And so, there's just some things in here where you can have a really good a culture or good people that kind of runs awry, right? Like,
Hmm.
with systems and so on. And so I have a lot of on that. So just tell us in a nutshell, at least to begin with here, what did go wrong at NASA, and why were people surprised to hear that it was a culture issue?
From a technical perspective, during Columbia's final launch, there was a piece of foam that fell off the external tank, which is that big orange structure in the shuttle system, and it hit the orbiter. And they didn't know exactly where it hit. It was over a minute into the launch, and so 130 cameras pointing at the launch, but none of them could capture the exact place of impact. And it didn't cause a problem for Columbia when it was in orbit. But what they didn't know for sure, what they didn't realize, is that the foam had actually done significant damage to the wing, and the heat shield was not able to sustain. So when they gave Columbia the green light to come back to Earth and it came through the layers of the atmosphere, Columbia disintegrated and broke apart.
Hmm.
And so that's what happened from a technical perspective. But the cultural pieces really come down to the fact that there were people at the agency that saw this happen and they were concerned. So three different teams across the agency had actually seen the video, and they were desperate to get more data. Without knowing exactly where it hit, they couldn't perform a high degree of accurate analysis to say this is going to be catastrophic or it's not. And so they had a data problem in a place where NASA has walls painted in some rooms that say, "In God we trust, all others must bring data."
Wow.
Right? People don't want to stand
Okay.
up there and say, "I just have a gut feeling
Right.
this is a problem." The other problem here that they were up against is there was a higher governing body that had said foam strikes are not an in flight issue. So the whole thing, technically, about foam hitting the orbiter was not new. It had been happening for years. It had happened many times before. And there's this phenomenon called normalization of deviation. Something doesn't quite go right, but it doesn't cause a disaster. And so, okay, maybe not so alarming. And it happens again. And once again, there's no disaster. So, okay, maybe not so alarming. So it starts to feel like it's normal. And people think, okay, this is not actually going to pose a safety threat. And it never had. Before that point, every time
Yeah.
foam hit the orbiter, it actually was hitting on the underbelly, which was a much stronger heat shield than the leading edge of the wing, which is where it happened to hit this time. So, on top of there being a data problem, these engineers who are concerned are also up against the fact that this has already been decided it's not an in flight issue. And so, for them to be trying to push to say, we want to get imagery, we want to ask the Department of Defense to spend, I've heard that it's in the millions, Steve. I can't tell you that for sure, but some very high amount of money to reposition satellites to see if we can get imagery of Columbia to see how bad the damage is, which, by the way, if they did, no clear plan as to what to do. There's no like, here's how you fix a hole in the wing
Yeah.
manual on the orbiter. And so all of these variables led to informal communication channels that people were following to see if they could get this request for imagery met, but it was shut down every time because there was no official requirement for it. And
Mhm.
people at a certain point didn't want to come across like Chicken Little screaming that the sky is falling, especially without data to back it up.
Yeah.
And so, that's just a little microcosm of some of the things that were happening where there's all these, cultural influences that are leading very, very smart people to make some bad decisions.
Yeah, I think in your book I pulled this out, and I think you said an organization can have many positive attributes and a positive culture, and also have the culture work against them.
Mhm.
So it's an interesting scenario, and it just we talk a lot on this program about right brain and left brain, thinkers, and how you need both, and when it's so data driven and so analytical, and there's not people don't embrace the gut feel, or don't embrace it just doesn't feel right or whatever,
Yeah.
and sometimes you need that.
Yeah. And there's external pressures as well. One of the other big things that the investigation found about the accident is that there was a disproportionate focus on schedule and budget.
Yeah.
There, at that point in time, the shuttle program had been around for about 22 years. And unfortunately, it was regularly on the chopping block. And so, my business partner loves to use this little example that I think is so telling. So, Steve, if you were at the top of the Empire State Building and there was a beam extending out over open air and there was a $100 bill at the end of that beam walking 50 feet out, would you go and get it?
Hell no.
I wouldn't either. Okay. But now imagine it's not a $100 bill at the end of that beam. Imagine it's your child or a loved one.
Yeah.
Would you go out there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So when we have a deep emotional attachment to something, we find ourselves being willing to take much bigger risks than when we do not. And the shuttle program was like their baby for so many of these engineers. It had been their
Yeah.
entire career. And the identity of working for NASA and working for the shuttle program was something they were so proud of. I mean, it was cool. It was so cool. And so for them to find out over and over again, the shuttle program is on the chopping block. Congress might cut funding and they might cancel the program. There was a mantra of save the program. And that meant that there was like, we have to finish the space station by this date, core complete. There was a deadline. It was literally screensavers on people's computers because it was like, we cannot miss the deadline. And so, just as an example, when the issue of the foam strike came up for the mission management team, partly because it was deemed not an in-flight issue, but also their attention was on schedule. And so the question for them wasn't, well, how bad is the damage to the orbiter now? And is that causing an in-flight safety risk? Their question was, how much is that going to delay the next launch because we have to reprocess the orbiter, which they always have to reprocess the orbiter, but that reprocessing will be variable, the timeline of it depending on damage. So it just goes to show you that when the focus is on schedule and budget rather than safety and technical, you start to have really big problems. And from an org design perspective, they were putting all of that in the seat of one person, which is wildly impossible.
And I'm sure that it took a while and digging deep and whatever, but I'm just curious, how do you find that out? I mean, is it just by interviewing lots of people or is it by, tell me how you came to the conclusion that it was a culture issue and how did you discover that?
Well, to be fair, I didn't actually come to that conclusion myself. It was the Columbia Accident Investigation Board that created the report, and they did a lot of interviews. So they investigated pretty deeply, a lot of the key personnel to understand what had happened. They dug into the emails they have, and anybody can actually look up the CABE report, the Columbia Accident Investigation Board CABE report. You can go to NASA's website and you can read about it, and they have an entire chapter dedicated to culture and a chapter dedicated to leadership on top of explaining like technically here's what's happened, specific emails, here was the communication that was going on. And part of what they pulled out of that, when I started there, as a psychologist, I was so fascinated by the whole subconscious nature of what was happening, because when they talked about the focus on schedule and budget, nobody is doing that knowingly to the detriment of safety, but it's just a matter of where was their attention. And so, there were reports in there, direct quotes from people in interviews saying things like, you don't want to think that schedule pressure influences decision making, but I don't see how it couldn't have, given the environment, what was going on.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
So let's back up a little bit and tell us a little bit now about you have Gallagher Edge Consulting. So
Gallaher, yes.
Gallaher, I'm sorry, Gallaher.
That's okay.
Okay. So tell us about what that company is and what you do now, and we heard the NASA story and you worked with Disney, but what do you do on the day to day in that company?
So we focus on applying the science of human behavior to drive organizational performance. And so it's really a lot of the insights that we gained from the work that we did together at NASA, looking at NASA's culture, because it's all just human stuff. And so what we do there is we're working with executive teams primarily. And the first step that we do with all of our clients, all of our executive teams, is we do some deep dives into self awareness and specifically self acceptance and self accountability as well. So, our foundational workshop is actually 3 days as a minimum. We often actually like to do more when our clients will give the time to it. And we are focusing entirely on how can these leaders better understand their own beliefs, and their own behavior, the impact they're having on others, and where are those things not in alignment. Because all of the best meaning teams, best meaning leaders, very intelligent people, they're all self deceived. I'm self deceived. I'm a psychologist. I do this work. I talk about it almost every day because I'm a huge nerd about it. And I'm self deceived. It's part of the human condition. And there are things that I can do to increase my own self awareness so that I am not misfiring. I'm not finding that I'm attempting to do this, but the impact is over there. And so we start with that, and we're really focusing on helping these clients optimize their human dynamics so they can achieve their desired business results. We focus on optimization all the time as leaders in businesses, right? We want to optimize the sales process, we want to optimize a tech stack, but most leaders don't think about optimizing the human dynamics. But I would say that the masterful leaders do. They're the ones that say, actually, who we each are and how we are showing up and how we are interacting touches literally every part of the business. There's nothing more important to optimize than that.
So I think most leadership training programs and leadership seminars or workshops or whatever will say that where you need to start with self-awareness. But you say radical self-acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us what is the difference there, and me, I think you referred to it a little bit already, but just tell us what the basic person is going to say. Sure, you need to start with self-aware. What is radical self-acceptance?
So I'll start with self acceptance, which is to say that it means being okay with who you are right now. And that includes your flaws and imperfections and your talents and strengths. The radical part is only because sadly it is pretty radical. Most people, especially high achievers, and a lot of leaders find themselves in the trap of listening to the inner critic and thinking that they need that fear of not being enough to drive them to grow and improve. Right. And so actually practicing self acceptance means I'm willing to let go of judgment of myself and show up in that way because it's transformational. And Steve, I can share with you that the reason it stood out to me so much is, like I mentioned, we were working with NASA on psychological safety. And I'd been there for a few years and I was going through a leadership training where we'd done a 360 assessment. And I remember sitting in the cafeteria during the lunch break and I had this like 30-page report. And I turned to this page where the respondents were asked, to what extent does Laura demonstrate these negative influence tactics? And I got pretty good feedback up to that point. But then on this page, I saw that there were a couple people on my team who indicated that I would sometimes bully them intellectually. Oh,
And you focused on that for sure.
well, I was, I
Yeah.
mean, I was horrified, right?
Yeah.
Because like that's not creating psychological safety. So here I am, this PhD in psychology, this internal coaching consultant that's working with the leaders to help them create psychological safety. And I was struggling to do that for at least a couple people on my own team. And so it just hit me with that experience that it's not enough to know. You can't just know what psychological safety is. I can't just know that it's important. I can't even just know what the components are because as a self-deceived human, I am behaving in ways that is driven by actually subconscious insecurities, that self judgment
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
detracts from my own effectiveness. And so, the key thing about how self acceptance plays into organizational culture is defense mechanisms get in the way of maximizing your productivity. Most common defense mechanism in organizations blame. Steve, have
Mm.
you ever worked in a company that has blame?
You know, I think all companies have blame at some point,
They
right?
do.
I was
Absolutely.
lucky enough to work in a really great company that I think it was less than most. That's
That's
my personal
great.
opinion, but I do know what you're talking about is that nothing's worse than being around people that are blaming other people all the time. It's toxic and it's
Yeah.
annoying. So yeah.
Yeah. And it blocks the flow of information. So when people's defense mechanisms are activated, basically everybody's IQ drops about 20 points on average, right? We all get a little bit dumber when we're in this defensive state where the ego kicks in and wants to say, like, no, not. Mm. And in those states, people's energy isn't going to solving the problem anymore. Their energy is going into self preservation.
Yeah.
And so you can have really, really smart people who suddenly become dumber together. And the information that they're sharing is no longer useful information that actually helps people understand what has happened. It just becomes a CYA
Yeah.
situation. And that gets in the way of organizational productivity. And so these defense mechanisms only exist because of self judgment. People think they're defending themselves against other people, but they're only ever defending themselves against their own internal harsh judgments. And when defense mechanisms are activated, they're actually activated to hide from you the things that you're not ready to see in yourself. And
Yeah.
so radical self acceptance is the key to creating psychological safety. It's the key to maximizing productivity in organizations, and it's the key to making literally everything in your life easier.
You make a good point. I think as the last guest I had on here interviewed, he did research and basically said that when you're triggered, like the defense mechanism comes up, you're triggered, that 75% of your thinking brain gets muddy and clouded, and you just turn into the fight or flight response,
Yeah.
and so you can't think as clearly. You like you said, you just
Yeah.
try and preserve what you think you have, and you forget all the good stuff. So
And you feel so justified in the moment of doing it. Right?
yeah, yeah,
Like, Steve, going back to my story about the intellectual bullying, I can promise you at no point in time that I wake up and drive 50 minutes into work and say, you know what I'm going to do today? I'm going to bully some people intellectually. Like, that was never my intention.
yeah,
But getting that feedback, I mean, it felt like a punch to the stomach for sure, but it offered me the opportunity to reflect and say, is this even 1% true? This is one of the tools we introduced to our clients. Is this even 1% true? Can I think of even 1% of situations where I can see where people would experience me that way? And yeah.
yeah,
And to peel the onion back deeper, it was if I was coming across as bullying intellectually, the examples I could think of were times where I felt really passionately about a direction, or I really wanted people to see why I was wanting to head in a particular way.
yeah,
And if I perceived that they weren't buying into my decision, instead of holding space, sometimes I would hold space, but in these instances, instead of holding space and like getting curious and finding out, tell me more about what you're thinking, let's see how we can get aligned and on the same page, I would start to pull in, well, here's research to back up my
yeah,
perspective, or well, this is what I've learned, in my PhD program, and that type of thing. And that is something that I was doing because subconsciously I feared that they weren't seeing me as competent. But that
yeah,
was my projection. That was a
yeah,
story in my head, a fear that I wasn't as competent as I wanted to be. And so, again, if I wasn't judging myself around my fears of competence, if I was practicing self acceptance to say, okay, well, this is just one thought that I have. I'd love to hear what you have to say too.
maybe
And
I
that
don't know
doesn't take
this.
away from my competence.
Yeah.
I would have been a much more effective leader to those folks.
It's what you're saying happens often in a conflict conversation. Let's say that, I'm trying to convince you of something and I'm not, you don't believe it, or you're resisting against it. And what most people do is what you just said is they lay down more and more facts to prove their point. But if you don't go back to the point where you can at least agree on something, then it doesn't matter how many facts you put on the table.
Does not.
It's just going to make it worse and worse. So, like I try and tell my clients, you need to go back and say, okay, can we agree on this? If we can agree on this, then we can start to build on it, but just don't lay down more and more facts. And then,
Yes.
yeah, and somebody with your education and your degrees and whatever, I'm sure that can come across as, oh boy, here she goes.
Oh, sure. And I
She's
was still in
gonna,
my 20s at that point too, Steve. I
yeah,
would, and so
yeah,
I remember I did not like it when people would comment on how young I looked when I was working there, because I was like, I want to be seen as some level of an authority. I mean, I was playing internal consultant to senior executive service, director of engineering, a 700-person organization who had his own doctorate, by the way, in business administration. So it was a DBA. Yeah, I didn't want people to like tell me how young I looked and that I looked like a baby. So I would absolutely like that was triggering insecurities in me. I was judging myself for that. I couldn't just be like, yep, I'm 28 or whatever. Like I was like, no, I wanted so badly for them to see me differently. And so
Yeah.
yeah, I was like, oh gosh, they felt like I was bullying them intellectually. Not my intention. Not what I want to
We're
do again.
working with interns in my field sometimes, or new professionals. I'm a physical therapist by trade, so you'd go get a patient, and in the waiting room and come back. Well, your first, maybe couple years, your most feared question is, when did you graduate? Because you don't want them to
Yeah,
think that you're right out of the, green as can be, because you want to be thought of as have more wisdom and more experience, whatever.
for
But
sure.
yeah, so
You want to be
I
seen
can
as competent. And
exactly.
that's okay. The people want to
Yeah,
be seen as competent. It brings up lots of other important questions to ask yourself, like, well, how do I define what it means to be competent? Do I think that
yeah.
means like knowing everything and having all the answers, or does competence mean
So
navigating the world effectively?
why do you believe people behave the way they do? Is it because we fear judgment? Is it because we want to look good? We, as you say, competent. We want to look competent. Why do people behave in the weird ways they do sometimes?
Yeah. So the theory that we use a lot in our work is the acronym for it is FIRO, FIRO, and it's the fundamental interpersonal relations orientation theory. It's created by Dr. Will Schutz when the Navy came to him actually in the 1950s, because the Navy found that on their submarines, the command center teams would sometimes perform well, and other times they would completely fall apart. And these were theoretically the best and the brightest. And so, what was happening? What was making some teams work together well and some teams not? And so they asked him to come in and help them figure this out. So he gathered empirical evidence for a couple decades and developed this theory around our human behavior. And so he looks at the human behavior lens to say you can take all of our human behavior and you can lump them into three categories. And there's pretty decent statistics to back this up if you want to get into the geeky psychometrics behind it all. But there's inclusion, there's control, and there's openness. And those are most closely linked to how we actually want to feel. So, the most important thing about the theory to our conversation, Steve, is that humans want to feel significant, competent, and likable to varying degrees. But these are the
Mhm.
three things that we want to feel. And so, if I am not feeling the level of significance, competence, or likability that I want to feel in a given situation, then my behavior is going to be motivated by helping me to manage that. As an example, let's say that I don't feel as significant as I want to feel. Like I don't know that I'm that important. And so that means I might really fear being ignored, right? Like if someone ignores me, that's going to trigger the fears that I have around my own significance. And so I might decide I'm not going to speak up in this meeting because if I speak up in this meeting and then they still ignore me, like they ignore me, too painful. I can't handle it. And so the most effective thing for me to do would be to speak up in the meeting. But my fear of feeling ignored and then feeling insignificant holds me back from doing what's truly effective. So
Yeah.
sometimes our behavior is motivated by I'm trying to drive this outcome in my external world. And way more than people realize, our behavior is actually driven by working to manage the feelings that we have about ourselves.
And taking that to the next step, in companies or teams, then what you need to do is to build that trust in each other and whatever, so that if you do say something stupid, or you do say something where you missed it and it was said 5 minutes ago, that you're not just buried, right? It's just,
Yes.
people say, okay, hey, point it out to you and go on, but don't judge you or
Yeah,
criticize you for,
don't belittle or demean or
yeah,
for
yeah,
sure. And that you're describing some of that psychological safety, right? Do we have the kind of
right,
environment where like how expensive is it for you to be vulnerable? Is it like
yeah,
I had one student one time say that she wouldn't dare share an idea with the team if she hadn't thought it through and found it to be bulletproof. Because if
yeah,
she did and they found something, it would be a bloodbath. I was like, oh my gosh, her words, right? She was just in my executive MBA program I was teaching, and this is what she was describing her work environment to be. that is not going to give you the best organizational performance. If you've got people who are terrified to share any ideas,
Yeah.
how could you ever think that you're getting the most out of your workforce? And so,
Yeah, exactly.
go
And it
ahead.
gets back to that thing too with perfection. You know, you want to only present it after you think it's perfect.
Yeah,
Well, first of all, one person isn't going to make it perfect. And secondly,
right.
if you think it's perfect, then you're less open to new ideas and new things
Yes.
to change, right?
Yes.
So, yeah,
Yeah. Something that we do all the time in my own team is we talk about sharing half baked ideas.
yeah,
I'll say, I don't want to share a half baked idea. And so I'm just acknowledging like there's all kinds of problems with it. And, what about this? We'll also say, I don't know if I like this idea, but here's something that we could do. Because the other thing that happens sometimes is people will hold back an idea because they know they haven't thought it through. And they're like, well, I might find flaws with this. And then I don't want to be held to, we have to do it because it was my idea. And so there's really small little things that people can do to create that kind of environment, And the half baked idea, this was so adorable, Steve. We had somebody on my team who was leaning into this practice with us, and she said, I don't think this idea is even half baked. It's more just like batter,
yeah, yeah.
like raw
That's funny.
form.
Yeah,
It's not
exactly.
quite ready for prime time, but she puts that out there, and then it's something that we can build upon. And so
Yeah,
that's the kind of environment that you want to be able to create. And part of that's about the environment that's created by the leader and the organization. And part of it is, what's my level of self acceptance? Am
yeah.
I personally willing, my self accepting enough to throw an idea out there that could be a terrible idea, or maybe it could be a great idea, but like I'm not attached to that idea as evidence of my self worth.
Yeah, I'm always so curious as to how we get to where we are and how we become who we are and so on. So I noticed in your TEDx talk that you talked about you went to 10 different countries in 10 months in your early training, and you actually traveled with your first hired employee, Kayla, I think,
Did.
and
Yep.
which was interesting as well. And you described, I'd be really interested to hear what you learned and how that changed you. But in the talk, you talked about how you redefined what home is after that.
Mhm.
So
I
share with us a
did.
little bit about that experience and what you got out of it.
So going on remote year was probably the most intense experience of my life. And sometimes, Steve, people will say, "Oh, you took a gap year." No, I did not. I did
Yeah.
not. I was actually running my business while I was traveling around. And I wouldn't recommend doing it again the way that I did it because it was just really, really hard on me. It's funny, the timing of this was 2018. And so I had told a lot of my clients, I can still engage with you virtually for coaching. That was fine. But I was wanting to still do, team meetings. And a lot of my clients were like, um, just let us know when you're back. And
Mm,
so, my revenue was not at all what I expected it to be. And so I was really struggling for those first like few months trying to figure out, okay, what is going to be the best way for me to continue to make money? Because I had Kayla as an employee, but I also had contractors. Like I had people that were depending on me. And so I was going through the difficulty of I think I was only 5 years into my entrepreneurial journey at that point. Um, I'm 12 years now, so I'm a little bit further along. So I was going through that while dealing with the fact that even small, everyday things were new. Can I drink the water here? Where do I take the trash out? What food do I eat? Culturally, what's acceptable here? Like the amount of new and uncertainty that I brought into my life, the biggest thing I learned was the importance of surrender,
mm,
actually. My desire to try to control everything, but yet I went into this experience literally letting go. I didn't actually choose the countries that we went to. I didn't choose where I lived. Didn't choose what the co-working space was. Like I threw so much control of my life over to other people. And then I was trying so hard still to control everything. And so in
interesting.
the TEDx talk, I share that I didn't feel at home anywhere really. Like home was wherever I was notionally, but what really matters for me is that home is about feeling at peace with who I am, because all of these different places and what I was going through with the business was just shining a really big spotlight on different insecurities that I had, different areas that I was judging myself. If I can let go of that self judgment and lean into the self acceptance practice, then I can truly feel at home anywhere.
And how do you think, it's such common, everyone talks about it now is this, people are stressed out, they're burned out, they're just kind of going through the motions and trying to survive and whatever. Do you think it's related to something like that? I mean, how do you counsel leaders that you work with to try and get out of that rut?
So, stress, this is the part, Steve, where I'm glad that nobody can throw anything at me, because I'll share that stress is a choice. And
Hmm.
I don't know, when I first learned that, I felt very defensive.
Yeah.
I didn't like
Okay.
hearing that at all
Yeah.
because it sounded to me like I was
You
being
don't understand what I have to do, what I go through.
you don't get it.
Yeah.
Um, so stress is a choice, and this is true on so many levels. I mean, on the surface level, you can look at this and say, well, what are the choices that you're making to choose to be a part of the environment where your stressors live? But I really like people to go deeper than that, because you're never responding to the world around you, ever. You're only ever responding to the meaning that you're putting on what's happening.
Mm.
And so that's the first question to ask, is if you're feeling stressed out and you're blaming a stressor like my workload, I have too much to do. The workload isn't actually the source of stress. The source of stress is the story you're telling yourself about what this all means. And so surface that for yourself. Is it, I'm going to miss a deadline, I'm going to let somebody down, I'm going to deliver subpar work that's not perfect, right? What is the narrative? But it doesn't just stop there, because there's another layer to peel back, which says, well, what does it say about you if you let somebody down? What does it say about you if you deliver subpar work, something less than perfection? That's what you want to work to surface. What is that self judgment? Because the self judgment is the actual source of stress and not the situation itself.
Mm.
So that means, once again, self acceptance is the antidote. If you're not going to judge yourself harshly for delivering something less than perfection, or for missing a deadline, or for letting somebody down, then you won't feel stressed. You'll still take steps to solve the problem. And that's the other thing to look at, is, do you believe that you must feel stressed out in order to solve the problem? Or do you have a story in your head that you have to feel stress and demonstrate how stressed out you are to show people that you care? So all of this comes back to, what is the story in my head? And how does a situation threaten how I want to feel about myself?
Yeah, yeah, that's a really interesting and great way to look at it. So that takes practice. That takes
It
practice.
does.
Yeah,
And that's what I call it, Steve. To me, it is a self acceptance practice. It,
yeah.
I have definitely not achieved, full enlightenment and full acceptance of self. I'm constantly discovering new ways that I am judging myself. And there are so many things from me over the last 15 years or so that I have been able to surface. Oh, I've judged myself really harshly for this. And I realized that I don't have to. I can practice acceptance here. And I am a much more effective version of myself when I do that.
Yeah, yeah, that's wonderful. Another thing that I I heard you say or read or something is was when you said competence isn't having the answer, it is the ability to cope with the world. So tell us what that statement means to you.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite things to ask myself in times when I find that fear is taking over, because there's really only one fear that any of us have. And once again, I'm not afraid of what might happen in the external world. My only fear is that I cannot cope with what happens. And this is
Mm.
such a powerful way for me to look at this. And I've brought this to so many clients who've found the utility in it as well, because that returns the power to me. I haven't yet figured out how to control all of that stuff out there. Right? Not sure how possible that really is. What I do know I can control, though, is this. And if I ask myself, if this were to happen, I can catastrophize with the best of them. If this thing goes horribly wrong, if this mistake happens, if I lose a client, if I lose this relationship, the question to ask is, if that were to happen, can I cope? Not, would I be happy? Just, can I cope with that?
Yeah.
And my answer to that has always been yes. I might feel a lot of sadness. I might feel some grief. I might I might even feel some, fear or scarcity. Like all those things might bubble up, but I trust that I can cope with it. I trust that I can take steps to solve that problem and work through it because I've coped with literally everything that life has thrown at me so far.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if my answer is no, or if your answer is that it's like, no, I couldn't cope with that, I would first say, probably you can, because check it out. You've coped with everything up to this point. And then the next question is, well, what can you do to increase your confidence that you can cope? And
Yeah.
then it's not about trying to control everything out there, but you just feel so much more empowered within yourself to deal with life, regardless of what's happening out there.
And even if you can't define what that means before it happens, I do think you have to have the trust or the confidence that, humans can do unbelievable things that there's no way they thought they could when
Yeah.
in a situation where they have to. So,
Yes.
in the front end, you might think, oh, I don't know if I could do that, but maybe what you need the confidence is, I'm not sure maybe how I would do that, but I know I can get through it.
Yes. I trust that I can figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's how I redefined what competence even means, right? Not having the
Yeah.
answer. It's do I trust that I can learn, grow, adapt, and figure things out?
Yeah.
And
That's
yeah, everything's figure outable.
so good. Well, let's talk about this book a little bit more. So, those that are watching this on video, I'm just going to hold up the book here, The Missing Links. And it's really a good book. I will tell you, coming from my perspective, it is a brainiac book, but yet it's done in a way that you tell good stories and you make things more simple and you take some of the more complex things and so congratulations, it's well
Thank
done.
you.
So in that sense, tell us a little bit about, because everybody talks about culture, but you talk more about organizational culture. So, there's culture and there's organizational culture. Is there a difference there? How would you define that?
So we talk about organizational culture. We have a very geeky definition of culture. I don't know if you remember it from the book, Steve, but it's we describe it as an emergent property of organizations
Yeah.
um, that emerges based on the interactions of the behaviors and beliefs of the employees. And so normally when we're bringing this really geeky definition of culture, we break it down into a couple different components. And to answer your question, is there a difference between culture and organizational culture? I would say yes, and the components are the same. I think that there's probably an additional level of complexity that you might find if you're talking about societal culture, but it's still the same concept, which is, um, do you want me to get into the emergence part so it doesn't just
Sure.
sit with that
Go for
geeky
it. Yeah,
definition?
yeah, yeah.
So, our favorite example of emergence is the taste of sugar. You know what sugar tastes like, right, Steve?
Absolutely.
It's in a lot of our food here in the US. So,
Yeah.
most of us know what that tastes like. That is an example of an emergent property, the taste of sugar. You can break it down, sugar, that is, and you can look at the pieces and parts, which is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. But I can't ask you to taste those individually, add it up in your head, and then tell me what sugar is going to taste like. Because it's based on how those things are interacting, how they come
Mhm.
together, the form it takes, and then the interaction emerges. In fact, you take those same elements, you combine them differently, you get something that tastes very different, like vinegar. And so culture is the same thing. It's you can't just use the, reductionist methods that we were taught when we were little in school of like break it down into pieces and parts and sum it back up. It's really about understanding the complexity of organizations and the multiple pieces and parts and the fact that it's adaptive because it's got human beings in it. Anybody that's worked in an organization knows you can't just tell somebody to do a thing and have them do it. It's not that simple. The adaptive part means humans push back, humans find another way. Humans do not simply follow a process because it's been outlined. And so that's where the science of human behavior becomes incredibly important in the definition of culture is we use this example of you could use physics to calculate throwing a rock. If I want a rock to land in a particular place, I could use science and deductive reasoning and I could say this is exactly the arc I need and the speed I need and everything so it lands right there. But if I want to do that with a bird, it's going to go a little bit differently. If I have a bird in my hand, a live bird, and I try to throw it with that same arc and the same speed, that bird has agency. That bird can go where it wants to go. So it's not a matter of just sort of saying these are the steps to take to get the bird to go there. I want to try to motivate that bird to land in the spot that I want it to be in differently. Putting down birdseed, for example. But
Yeah.
human beings, of course, are more complicated than that. You know, donuts and bagels can be a great motivator, but it doesn't usually get the exact level of performance that you're looking for. So we want to be able to understand what really drives human beings on a fundamental level and design your culture so that that is actually getting met. And then the culture that you want is actually going to emerge from that.
And I think a lot of people make mistakes, right? You say in the book, like you say that you identify, oh, this is a really great culture. This is so cool. We're going to copy that and put it into my company and have the exact same result. Usually those fail.
Yes, it almost never works. Like the benchmarks, when they, benchmarking other people's culture, it doesn't work. And it's because it's about so much more than what you can see. There's the visible artifacts of somebody's culture. We always joke about the ping pong table because we worked a lot with a lot of tech startups when I started this
Yeah.
company back in 2013. And most of them had a ping pong table. And one of the clients that we worked with, actually beyond a ping pong table, they had a whole game room. So there's a ping pong table, but they also had like a video game set up and foosball and all kinds of stuff. But the leadership team had never actually talked about, why are we choosing to have this? What do we believe about what this game room offers? And the mixed sentiment amongst the leadership team trickled down into the organization. And so some people thought it was super cool and like, what a great perk. And others were super cynical about it. And they thought, this is just something that they do in order to get us to stay here longer and try to get more work out of us. And so
Yeah.
if you don't have a cohesive idea, if you don't understand the beliefs that underlie the behavior that really drives your culture, copying somebody else's isn't going to get you anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And I tell my clients all the time, you just have to define, tell people why you're doing things. You have to be crystal clear with that because you
Yes.
can't assume they're going to know. You can't
Mm,
assume they're going to think the same way you do. So, as elementary as it may seem, you have to tell them why we're doing this and doing that.
for sure. Because you're always
Yeah.
sending out signals as a leader. Everything you say and don't say, everything you do and you don't do is sending signals out. Some of those are going to get crossed. And so taking the time, like you're saying, Steve, to be really explicit, even stating the things that you think might be obvious, can make a really big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, not to cut it down into just a tiny little bit, but the book, the missing links that you identify are self-awareness, self-acceptance, and self-accountability. So we've talked quite a bit about awareness and acceptance. What about self-accountability?
Yeah, and so you're describing the maturity strand of the model, which is that's our foundation. We always start there. There's other strands and other links that we look at as well.
Right.
So self accountability is really about recognizing contribution. So to circle back, Steve, I brought up blame earlier. Most common defense mechanism in organizations is blame. And unfortunately, it's the default reaction that a lot of people have when something has gone wrong. Or if I perceive somebody pointing the finger at me, perhaps my gut reaction is to want to point the finger back at them, respond with that defensiveness. This is so toxic in organizations. It happens at least a little bit in every company. You're very fortunate that you didn't have a ton of that where you worked. Um,
But it
but
happens.
it
Yes, it
happens, right?
happens.
And
Yes.
and that's how we talk about it. There's a negative accountability loop that happens in organizations, and there's a positive accountability loop, and they both happen in every organization sometimes. The goal is, how can we turn it into positive accountability more? Negative accountability is that blame game, and it's terrible. It shuts down the flow of information, and then people are trying to solve problems and make decisions based on not really understanding what happened. When you have positive accountability, that actually starts with self accountability. And so, what that means is, if something's gone wrong, you and I are going to solve that problem most effectively if we come together and I share with you, here are the things that I think I did to contribute to what happened. That's my action and my inaction, right? Things that I did and didn't do, things I said and didn't say. So if I'm looking at my contribution and you're looking at your contribution, and we're each bringing that level of self accountability to the problem solving conversation, we have so much more information about what's actually happened. It feels like we're on the same team while we're working to get on the same page. And that's the kind of vibe that every organization wants to have, but they struggle to do it because these subconscious defense mechanisms pop up. And so that's where the relationship comes back to self acceptance.
Yeah.
So higher self acceptance leads to higher self awareness and higher self accountability. which
Yeah.
drives all of the productivity in organizations.
That's great. So we're kind of coming up the to time here. So I got so many more things I want to ask you. I think we could go on for hours. So uh, I want to bring up a couple things and tell me what's most important, where you want to go with this.
Okay.
Okay? Because in the book you also talk about drivers of effective cultures, and those drivers are growth, belonging, connection, identity. And then you also talk about, the different levels of maturity, diversity, community, unity. Those are all so important to culture. So we can dive into that a little bit. I know there's a lot there. Or I also know that you do kind of that self-awareness survey, and that you have clients do, and then you had me do. So it's that's an interesting piece too. So in considering the time that we have, where do you want to go with this?
Yeah, let's chat about the self-acceptance quiz
Okay,
for a
sure.
moment. Yeah, and so, the self-acceptance, the way that we look at it and the way that we do our work, when we talk about organizational culture and optimizing results, it actually all comes back to self-acceptance at the core. If every human being had a higher degree of self-acceptance, the organization would function at a much higher level. And self-acceptance is really misunderstood. People often think that practicing self-acceptance means you're going to stop improving. But
Hmm.
those two aren't opposites. The opposite of self acceptance isn't self improvement. The opposite of self acceptance is self judgment. And so, as a high achiever, as a leader, you can focus on self improvement from a self judging lens, or you can focus on self improvement from a self accepting lens. And that's paradox theory. And that's what the quiz is designed around. So it's super short, right? Like 3 to 5 minutes.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
real
It's
fast.
easy to take. Yeah.
And then, so you'll get your report immediately and it shows you, where are you in this 2 by 2? Which quadrant do you end up on? Are you higher or lower on self acceptance? Are you higher or lower on self improvement? A lot of the people that take it aren't quite where you are, Steve. You're in that flowing and growing, high self acceptance, high self improvement. So you figured out this paradox and you've, right? Like in your life, you've learned
Yeah,
I can feel good about who I am right now. And I don't need the fear of not being enough to drive me to improve.
yeah,
Other things inspire my growth. But a lot of people that I work with are very high on self improvement, but they're still so hard on themselves. They still beat themselves up so much and they don't actually recognize how much that's getting in their own way. And so
interesting.
the quiz also comes along with several coaching emails that people will receive that are tailored specifically to what their results were that help them if you want to get more up to that flowing and growing
Yeah,
quadrant that you're in, Steve. What are the things that they can do and how can they better understand how they've come to be where they are so they can be in that place where they're both high on self-acceptance and high on self-improvement?
yeah. So if someone wants to take that survey and kind of see where they're at, tell us how to do that.
Just go to selfacceptancequiz.com.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, it's really interesting, and when I took it, you just answer what your gut responses to it are and whatever. But I do think that's where experience comes in. Been around a while. I've been working in this area for a long time, and you kind of do accept things that maybe earlier in your career you would fight or challenge or
I would
question.
invite you to take more credit than that, Steve, because I think that I've worked with so many people who have had a lot of experience and they have not come to those same conclusions. They still actually are very hard on themselves. Sometimes they become bitter and cranky at the world because they've spent so much of their life sort of stuck in blame or feeling like a victim. So it's not experience alone. There's always some degree of intentionality uh, and growth and self acceptance as a practice. There's a quote from Dr. Robert Holden that says, "There is no amount of self improvement that will ever make up for a lack of self acceptance."
Wow, that's powerful. That's good.
Yeah, it's its own practice.
Yeah. Well, Laura, at this point in the interview, I always ask my guests the same common question. And that question is, in relation to leadership, what is a pearl of wisdom that you could leave us with today?
Listen like it's not about you.
Hmm, that's great. That's
That's
great.
one that I practice a lot.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Laura, this has been a real pleasure. I mean, like I said, I haven't even touched on half things I wrote down that I want to talk to you about. So we should do this again maybe sometime. But
I would love that.
But it's been a real pleasure, and yeah, I love your approach, and the book's fantastic, and I do think I'm a culture guy. That's what I try and do is help people, develop better cultures and leadership and things like that. So it really resonated with me. But sounds like you're doing great work out in the world, and so keep doing what you're doing. And again, it's been great to learn from you today.
Thank you so much, Steve.
Okay, well, we'll take care, and we'll maybe see you down the road someday. Bye bye. Thank you for listening to another episode of Profiles in Leadership. To listen to all my interviews, subscribe to Profiles in Leadership with Steve Anderson on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, and many other popular podcast platforms. Some of these interviews are on video, and you can search YouTube for Profiles in Leadership with Steve Anderson. You can also access the entire library of interviews on my website, orange.coaching.com, and that is orangetheword.coaching.com, and go to the Media Center and click on Podcasts or Video Gallery. You can also enter the website from pilpodcast.com.